Hey everybody, welcome to the children's sermon. Do you realize what this is? This is my Mr. Rogers sweater. I wore it for the first 3 children's sermons, and I haven't worn it since, so I'm so glad that I brought it back. Look, it's got the elbow patches and everything. We are back to business here, sitting beside my Christmas tree for this children's sermon this week. Now, during the services, during this Advent season at Bethany, we've been reading from the prophets. And we've been doing this series called The Voices of the Prophets. And so we've been hearing these messengers of God and the different things that they had to say. And so I thought, we need to do a children's sermon about God's messengers. And I got one for you today. It's from, of course, the Jesus Storybook Bible, and it's the story of Jonah. But I think you'll find it really interesting because Jonah doesn't really listen to God's message the first time. I don't want to get ahead of myself. I don't want to spoil it. Here we go. The story of Jonah and the whale. It's called God's Messenger.
God's Messenger. God had a job for Jonah, but Jonah didn't want it. Go to Nineveh, God said, and tell your worst enemies that I love them. No, said Jonah. Those are bad people doing bad things. Exactly, said God. They have run far away from me, but I can't stop loving them. I will give them a new start. I will forgive them. No, said Jonah, they don't deserve it. I'll run away, Jonah said to himself, far away, so far away that God won't be able to find me. Then I won't have to do what God says. It's a good plan, he said, because as far as he knew, it was a good plan. But of course, it wasn't a good plan at all. It was a silly plan, because you can run away from God, but God will always come and find you. Jonah went ahead with his not very good plan. 1 ticket to not Nineveh, please, he said, and boarded a boat sailing in the very opposite direction of Nineveh. Well, it wasn't long before a fierce wind blew, and the boat started to lurch and pitch and roll, and everyone started turning green. Jonah sat bolt upright in his bed. You see, the first thing that went wrong with Jonah's not very good plan was that God sent a big storm after him. The sailors couldn't sail their ship properly. We're sinking, they screamed, and started throwing everything overboard, suitcases, food, whatever they could find. By now, Jonah knew that the storm was his fault. Throw me in instead, he shouted to the sailors, and the storm will stop. The sailors weren't sure. It's the only way you can be saved, Jonah cried. And so, 1, 2, 3, splash! No sooner had Jonah hit the water than the waves grew calm, the wind died down, and the storm stopped. Just then, when Jonah thought it was all over, when he was sure he was going to drown, God sent a big fish to rescue him. The fish swallowed Jonah whole, with one big gulp. Jonah must have thought he died. It was so dark in there, like in a tomb. But then he smelled the rotting food and felt the slimy seaweed and knew he wasn't dead. He was in the belly of the fish. Sitting there in the darkness for 3 whole days, Jonah had plenty of time to think. Pretty soon he realized his plan was, well, a very silly plan indeed. He was sorry for running away. He prayed to God from inside the great fish and asked God to forgive him. After 3 days, the fish spat Jonah safely out onto a sandy beach. Just then, Jonah heard someone calling his name. Go to Nineveh, God said. And this time, Jonah said, yes. He went straight to Nineveh and told everyone God's wonderful message. Even though you've run far from God, God can't stop loving you, Jonah told them. Run to God so God can forgive you. The people of Nineveh listened to Jonah, and they started loving God. They learned to do what God said and to stop running away from him, just like Jonah. Many years later, God was going to send another messenger with the same wonderful message. Like Jonah, he would spend 3 days in utter darkness. But this messenger would be God's own son. He would be called the Word, because he himself would be God's message. God's message translated into our own language. Everything God wanted to say to the whole world in a person.
Yeah! I love you guys.
Oh, I love you too, Dad.
Wow. So wasn't that a good story? And wasn't it kind of fun watching my kids run all around the house just to be able to find me to give me a big hug? I know I liked it. But I did that silly little skit with them. One, because they wanted to be involved. But two, because it's a really good synopsis of Jonah's story. Jonah kept running and running and running, and then he finally listened to what God was asking him to do. And in the end, what Jonah does is he tells the people in Nineveh that they can't run from God's love. You can't run and hide from God's love. God's love is always going to find you. It's like running all around until you finally get that big hug in the end. And here's what's really interesting. On Sunday, we're going to hear not only a reading from a prophet, but we're also going to hear a reading about Mary. And Mary, she didn't run from God's call. She listened to what God had to say, and she sang a joyful song, and she did what God asked her to do. She gave birth to Jesus and cared for him and raised him. And so it's a good reminder for us to listen to God's call. And a good reminder for us that we can't run or hide from God's love. It'll always find us. So, your homework for this week, the way we're going to put our faith into practice, I want you to make a Christmas card for someone. For a neighbor, for the mailman, for the delivery person, make someone a Christmas card. A friend, a family member, make them a Christmas card so that they feel some sense of love. Help remind somebody this week that they're loved too. We all need to hear that this time of year. I'm Pastor Nate. This is my Christmas tree. This is the Mr. Rogers sweater. And this has been the Children's Sermon. Thanks for watching, everybody. See you next week. Bye-bye.